the environment, the atmosphere in this country for our job creators, not doing another Washington-directed spending program that has already demonstrated that it doesn't work. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
without objection.
Mr. President, the world has witnessed considerable upheaval in the Mideast this year as citizens from all walks of life have turned out by the millions to say that they've had enough with repressive regimes, stagnant political systems, and economies that have really disadvantaged many young people and poor people. In fact, we should probably look back to the summer of 2009 when thousands upon thousands of ordinary Iranians bravely took to the streets to peacefully protest the country's likely stolen election. These Iranian citizens were met with brutal violence, death, detention, and unspeakable torture. While Iran's ruling dictatorship was able to temporarily repress the public aspirations of its own people, the seeds for wider public discontent were taking root through much of the region. First, in Tunisia, we saw peaceful protests lead to the ousting of a corrupt, longtime strongman, President Ben Ali. Next, Egypt's President Mubarak, forced to resign following sustained peaceful protests in Cairo and elsewhere in Egypt. And then, of course, Muammar Gaddafi. His reign of erotic and despotic rule is finally coming to an end. Other popular calls for political and economic reform from Bahrain to Yemen remain in flux. And as we saw this weekend with the violent and troubling protests breaching the Israeli embassy in Cairo, ousting a repressive regime is only one step on a long road toward building effective long-term democratic and economic institutions. The United States, through President Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, stand ready to support these peaceful transitions. But most of the hard work has to come from within, from the people who made the historic change in the first place. Mr. President, amid so much upheaval and change and potential hope, it is critically important that we also keep our attention on what's happening in another very important country in the Middle East, Syria. Since March, millions of protesters have peacefully taken to the streets of towns and villages across Syria, demanding an end to the brutal dictatorship of the Assad family. The Syrian people have suffered 40 years of economic hardship, political repression, and corruption under the Assad family. First, under former President Hafez al-Assad, and now under his son Bashar al-Assad. Let me give you an example of life under the Assad regime. Almost 30 years ago, then President Hafez al-Assad ruthlessly leveled a portion of the town of Hama to put down a rebellion by his own people. Between 10,000 and 20,000 fellow Syrians were literally buried to death in the rubble. This is how political dissent was dealt with in Syria. And what has been his son's strategy for addressing public demand for change? Tragically, following in his father's footstep, mass murder. Since the popular uprising began, anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 people have already been slaughtered by Assad's security services. Government snipers on rooftops have fired on those who dare to go outside in areas where protesters are active. Men have been rounded up and detained in nighttime house-to-house raids. Tanks and anti-aircraft guns have been used against civilians and civilian buildings. A recent example, sadly one that isn't unique, obviously shows that the current Assad regime has no sense of history. Last month, government troops, backed by tanks, armored vehicles, and snipers, entered the heart of Hama, the same town that had been flattened by Assad's father 3 decades before. They went there to quash anti-government protesters. Our dedicated U.S. Ambassador Robert Ford had gone to Hama not long before the siege to serve as a witness to the unfolding events. I'd like to show you this photo, Mr. President. This photo shows a giant Syrian flag held by the crowd during a protest against President Assad in the city of Hama on July the 29th. The town, already under siege for days, saw its telephone, water, and electricity cut off at 5 a.m. as a prelude to the deployment of forces. Residents tried to stop the advancing armored columns with barricades, many of them built out of simple things like furniture and rocks and cinder blocks. They didn't stand a chance. Dozens were killed and hundreds were wounded. Such public resilience and government brutality have continued unabated in Syria for months. President Assad's tyrannical actions have been condemned around the world. The Arab League, not always known for democratic advocacy, has urged Syria to, quote, end the spilling of blood and follow the way of reason before it's too late, end of quote. Syria's neighbor and a significant trading partner, Turkey, has spoken out. Turkish President Gül said he has, quote, lost confidence in the Syrian government. Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey has said Turkey can no longer defend Syria. British Prime Minister Cameron, French President Sarkozy, German Chancellor Merkel jointly issued a statement urging Assad to, quote, face the reality of the complete rejection of his regime by the Syrian people and to step aside in the best interest of Syria and the unity of its people, end of quote. The United Nations Human Rights Office in Geneva has issued a sweeping report concluding that the Syrian government of Assad may have committed crimes against humanity through summary execution, torture, and harming children. President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have sharply criticized the Syrian government for their crackdown, and most recently the administration announced additional sanctions against the regime, including squeezing Assad's cash lifeline from petroleum exports. The European Union has cut its purchase of Syrian petroleum. Senators Gillibrand and Lieberman have introduced legislation I am pleased to support. It further tightens sanctions against Syria's petroleum exports by penalizing those who buy Syrian oil or invest in its energy sector, an approach Congress has supported in the past against Iran. I urge others to support this legislation and for Congress to pass it as quickly as possible. And when the crackdown in Syria began, I joined Senators Lieberman, McCain, Cardin, and Kyle, and at least 20 others, in a resolution condemning the violence. I understand that Senator Rand Paul has a hold on this resolution and has had for a number of months. I hope that he will consider the bloodshed and carnage in Syria as he continues to hold up this official action by the United States Senate. I call on Senator Rand Paul to work with us on his concerns, if he has any, in the wording of this resolution, but to do it in a timely manner so we can move forward and put the Senate on record when it comes to these tragic events in Syria. There's a lot more the international community can do. Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa are still blocking a United Nations Security Council resolution that it could impose more sweeping international sanctions on Syria. I simply don't understand the fact that they are stopping this effort, that some of these countries have emerged in their own right from decades under repressive regimes only to sit silently as Assad slaughters his own people is extremely troubling. Russia and China should also pledge not to purchase any Syrian oil, which is used by Assad to pay off his enablers and his security henchmen. Human rights monitors, humanitarian workers, and journalists must be allowed in the country, and the International Criminal Court should start an investigation into the indictment of President Assad for war crimes. Mr. President, this administration has shown great skill and diplomacy in navigating the turbulent calls for change in the Middle East. These are demands from everyday people for a better life, for a chance to freely choose one's own government, and to see hope and dignity for one's children. The people of Syria should know that the rest of the world is watching and supporting their aspirations for freedom. Mr. President, Saturday night in a suburb of Chicago, I had a meeting with about 30 Syrian Americans, and we spoke at great length about the situation in the country of their birth. Many of them still have relatives and family, friends in Syria, and they are following on YouTube and through the international media the events of the day. They showed me on one of the computers nearby some of the YouTube footage which showed the Syrian security forces literally shooting a man dead point blank. You could see him lying in the street, and you could see the blood flowing from his body. To suggest that these peaceful protesters are anything else is to really misstate the obvious. These people, by and large, in the streets of Syria, are asking for the same thing that was asked for across the Middle East. They're asking for a chance for reform, for change, for self-rule. I promised my friends and people I represent in Illinois, who have such strong feelings about Syria that I would do my best when I return to Washington this week. This floor statement is just the beginning. Just a few moments ago, I got off the telephone with a phone conversation with Ambassador Ford in Damascus. He's really done an exceptional job for our country. He's risked his life to let those who are protesting peacefully know that the United States is in their corner. We talked about the situation on the ground, and he is a man of great talent and experience in the Middle East, and he analyzed all the different forces at work. We know that Iran is, in fact, the major supporter and promoter of Assad and his repressive regime. We know as well that these 5 countries in the United Nations, Russia, India, China, Brazil, and South Africa, are stopping United Nations action when it comes to Syria. I find it hard to imagine how some of these countries, in light of their own history, could ignore the obvious. The killing of innocent people in the streets of Syria cannot be tolerated, shouldn't be condoned, and shouldn't be protected by their veto in the United Nations. I'm going to work with President Obama and this administration and my friends in Congress on both sides of the aisle to let the people of Syria know that what's happening there has not been ignored by the United States Congress. I hope that Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky will at least lift his hold on bipartisan legislation, which we have pending here, which will express that sentiment in the strongest of terms. The people of Syria deserve that message, to know that the people of the United States, through their elected representatives in the Senate, understand their plight, stand behind them, and will work to bring justice to their country. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection.
And I ask consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, calendar number 128, that the nomination be confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of Senate Resolution 256, and the Senate proceeds to its consideration.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 256, designating the week of October 2nd through October 8th, 2011, as National Nurse Managed Health Clinic Week.
Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate proceeds to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any related statements be printed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration en bloc of the following resolutions which were submitted earlier today. Senate Resolutions 262, 263, 264, and 265.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the resolutions be agreed to, the preambles be agreed to, the motions to reconsider be laid upon the table en bloc with no intervening action or debate, and any related statements be printed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand there are 3 bills at the desk. I ask for their first reading en bloc.
Without objection, the clerk will report the bills.
S-1549, a bill to provide tax relief for American workers and businesses and so forth and for other purposes. H.R. 2832, an act to extend the generalized system of preferences and for other purposes. H.R. 2887, an act to provide an extension of surface and air transportation programs and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I now ask for a second reading en bloc, and I object to my own request en bloc.
Objection is heard. The bills will have the second reading on the next legislative day.
I ask unanimous consent when the Senate completes its business today to adjourn until 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday, September 14th, that following the prayer and the pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, and the time for the 2 leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. That following any leader remarks, the Senate be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half. And that following morning business, the Senate resume consideration of the motion to proceed to H.J. Res. 66, a joint resolution regarding Burma sanctions and the legislative vehicle for additional FEMA funds post-cloture. Finally, that all time during adjournment, morning business, and recess count post-closure on the motion to proceed to House Joint Resolution 66.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we expect to begin consideration of House Joint Resolution 66 during Wednesday's session. We also hope to consider the FAA and highway extensions, which were received from the House. Senators will be notified when votes are scheduled, and if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow.